I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a door. I simply set my coffee down, looked my father-in-law in the eye, and said, "You're absolutely right. Your daughter does deserve better." My name is Patrick Grant. I'm 37 years old, and for the last 12 years I've made a living as a ghost, the kind of investor who moves in shadows and signatures. On paper, you'll never find me. The entities I use are clean as bleached bone, special purpose vehicles, blind trusts, holding shells stapled to other holding shells. When you finally peel back the last layer and expect to see a face, all you find is another document with another registered agent in another state. Invisible, controlled, boring if you don't like power. Arthur Winslow has always loved visible power. He likes the kind of power that drives up in a German V12 and parks in front of the steakhouse valet with the lights still on. He built Winslow Biotech out of his father's manufacturing fortune with the same philosophy he applies to every conversation. Talk louder than your opponent, and people will assume you're right. For 3 years, the entire length of my marriage to his daughter Claire, he made a sport of reminding me that I was beneath her, beneath the family, beneath his table. Claire could have married Jonathan Wallace's boy, he declared that morning, wagging his coffee mug like a maestro's baton. Partner at 34. Brilliant. Driven. Respectable. Claire sat at the breakfast bar, fork idling in a drift of eggs she had no intention of eating. She didn't look up. She never looked up when her father began his rituals. She just kept stirring, metal against ceramic, a soft clock measuring the seconds of my patience. "Patrick works in finance," she murmured, the same way you might mutter a weather report. "Non-committal. Harmless. Unhelpful." "Finance," Arthur snorted. "Which means what? Selling annuities to middle school teachers? Managing retirement funds out of a strip mall? Real men can state what they do." I let the words slide by as if they were smoke. I'd already traced Winslow Biotech's cash burn that morning, flagged 2 overdue payables, and reviewed the draft term sheet for the lifeline they'd been chasing for 8 months. He didn't know the lifeline wore my fingerprints. "You sit there like a statue," Arthur said, voice rising. "Real men defend themselves." "You're right," I told him gently. "Claire does deserve better." The kitchen fell silent, as if someone had shut off the HVAC. Claire finally looked at me. There was a quick twitch in her left cheek, the same one that surfaced when she expected an apology. She had no idea I was done apologizing. I offered them both a polite smile, walked to the front door, and let the cold November air rake my lungs clean. I had work to do. I met Claire 5 years earlier under a different kind of lighting. She was on stage in Santa Fe, laser pointer steady, explaining a gene therapy pathway with the kind of lucid precision that makes you forget how complex the science is. I wasn't there to fall in love. I was there to assess whether medical tech was finally catching the maturity curve my models promised. I'd seen presenters who could sell a lab coat to a lawyer. Claire wasn't selling anything. She was teaching. She was humble, fierce, and uninterested in applause. When the Q&A ended, I stood in the aisle longer than I should have, pretending to type notes so I could listen to her thank the AV tech. We talked after, about samples and solvents, and the kind of quiet habits only disciplined people keep. We didn't talk about money. We didn't need to. She had grants to chase, and I had investments to hide. The distance between our worlds felt like a bridge we could build. We married in 18 months with a ceremony that smelled like pine and rain. 27 people. 2 guitars. No speeches. The photos look like a magazine spread now. Mountains holding up a low gray sky. My hand on the small of her back. Her smile calm as clean linen. Arthur hated every second of it. He wanted a ballroom and a string quartet and a donor wall with his name carved in brass. He made do with dropping hints about a larger reception for the real network. That never happened. I shrugged it off. Claire did too, at first. The drip began our first Christmas. "So," Arthur asked, swirling red wine like it was a stethoscope, "which firm is it again?" "Independent," I said. "Portfolio strategy. Private placements. I spend most of my time on diligence and structure." He nodded as if that meant nothing. "Consultant. Investor," I said without heat. He grinned like he'd caught a fish and was posing for the photo. Right. I could have told him I controlled more capital than he had ever personally risked. I could have spelled out the sectors, the instruments, the leverage ratios, the places I preferred to be quiet, and the ones where I liked to press a thumb against a throat until an opposing board nodded yes. Instead, I reached for the potatoes and asked about his golf swing. I've found that when a man is desperate to measure himself, it's best to let him use a ruler of his choosing. But repetition is erosion. Every dinner wore a groove. Real men don't hide. Real men protect their families. Real men don't drive cars that look leased. And Claire, always trying to manage the weather, would touch my arm under the table, a soft pressure that meant please don't escalate. It took me 2 years to realize that a pressure that is always applied is a pressure that chooses a side. 3 months before that November morning, my research on Winslow Biotech stopped being curiosity and turned to triage. They'd inked a 7-figure development contract they weren't ready to execute. They'd pushed a compound toward phase 1 trials with stability data that read like a teenager's diary. They'd lost 2 distribution partners after a repositioning that was just a panic with PowerPoint slides. They needed a savior with a checkbook that didn't bounce and a spine that did not bend. I'm not in the habit of being either, but the science had promise if someone wrestled it out of Arthur's ego. The spreadsheet didn't care that he called me small. The spreadsheet said 15 million in, staged against milestones, board seat, veto on product launch, discipline on pipeline, exit in 4 to 6 years with a 4x if the compound hits. I don't confuse privilege with punishment. I don't invest to teach lessons. But sometimes paths fork for reasons that have nothing to do with cash flows. Sometimes a man keeps sharpening the knife he uses on you, even while you polish the plate he eats from. Sometimes you put the knife back in the drawer and watch him try to cut meat with his hands. We were 3 courses into Claire's 32nd birthday dinner when Arthur decided to tell the story of a boat that wasn't his. The room smelled like sugar and charred rosemary, the kind of scent you pay caterers extra to engineer. There were 20 people in his dining room, none of whom knew how to leave a silence alone. 40 feet, Arthur declared. Jonathan's boy bought it outright. No note. That's a man who knows how to make a living. He turned to me, eyes bright. What about you, Patrick? Any grand purchases? New property? Maybe a real car? Claire's nails bit my palm under the table. Don't. That's what the pinch meant. Don't provoke him. He'll never let it go. She believed that because it was true. She also believed it because the cost of contradiction had always been charged to someone else. Patrick prefers to keep things simple, she said. You know that, Dad. Arthur spread his hands, benevolent in mock sympathy. Of course. Practical. Nothing wrong with practical. It's just that ambition tends to leave a footprint, doesn't it? Someone tittered. Uncle Don coughed. The chandelier buzzed. I looked at Claire. Really looked. And I saw it. A shadow behind her eyes I had been refusing to name. She wasn't embarrassed that he was insulting me. She was embarrassed that I wouldn't play the game the way he played it. She had spent her entire life smoothing his ripples. She had never built a dam. I set my napkin down, stood, and kissed her forehead. You do deserve better, I said softly. Her breath caught. Hurt, confusion, a plea that died before it reached her lips. I walked out without waiting for permission and let the front door close on a room that had mistaken me for a man who needed their approval to exist. The drive home was short enough that I could count the red lights. At the third one, I realized the term sheet for Winslow Biotech sat on my desk with a pen beside it. All it needed was 30 seconds of ink and a few emails to become a rope for Arthur to pretend he'd braided himself. At the fourth light, I smiled so wide it hurt. I called Mark Dalton, my attorney, as soon as my garage swallowed the car. 3 documents, I told him. Withdrawal of investment interest. Termination of draft. And I want a narrowly tailored confidentiality release that lets me identify myself as the investor after the withdrawal lands. Mark is one of those lawyers who could have been a surgeon if blood didn't annoy him. He likes precision. He likes sequences that click. He also knows when to ask questions you pretend you've already answered for yourself. You know this is clean, he said, voice tinny through my speaker. No binding commitment. No detrimental reliance you didn't disclaim. If you're asking me whether you'll win the legal part, you will. If you're asking me whether you'll sleep well, I can't advise on that. I'm asking for draft language by 9 and a courier by 10, I said. He laughed once. You're lucky I like your money. We executed the plan the next morning with the kind of boring choreography I love. At 9:58 a.m., Mark's courier stepped into Winslow Biotech's lobby with a folder that could stop a heart. At 10 a.m., the receptionist stamped the receipt. At 10:02 a.m., my calendar ticked over to a new block titled Silence. At 10:17 a.m., Claire called. Dad's freaking out, she said without hello. They lost their lead investor. 15 million, Patrick. He's saying bankruptcy out loud. Could you ask around? Maybe you know who they are? I looked out my office window at a sky the color of a nickel. I'll see what I can do. Thank you, she breathed. Relief and expectation braided into a rope she didn't know she'd soon be holding alone. That afternoon, I sent 2 scheduled messages. One for Claire, one for Arthur, both timed to hit at exactly 10 a.m. the next day. Short, polite, final. I was your lead investor. I chose to withdraw. I wish your company the best. Night fell in layers. I didn't go home. I stayed in the office and opened a file Claire never thought I'd read. An internal memo from the previous year with her name on the cover page and a 20-page analysis inside. It detailed why Neurovance, 13, Arthur's pet compound, wasn't ready for clinical trials. It wasn't just a caution, it was a map of failure. She had written it in the calm, organized voice I fell in love with, the one that cares more about truth than theatrics. Arthur had ignored it, fast-tracked the application, and lit $3 million on fire. Then he blamed her for negativity, made her office a funhouse of punishment, and told anyone who'd listened that academia softens spines. He'd called her cautious as if it were a slur. He'd driven her out of the company and pretended the door had opened because she wanted a new view. I had intended to be nothing but a ledger to this man. Numbers don't care whether you're kind. But the memo moved something in me I thought finance had buried. Respect without a voice becomes complicity. I couldn't put my name on a line that would reward a man for breaking the only person who'd ever made me want to stop hiding. At 9:45 a.m. the next morning, I called Claire. Sit down, I told her. I'm going to say something you'll want a chair for. She didn't sit. I could hear the loose rattle of a drawer sliding open. Patrick, what are you doing? I was the investor, I said. The one your father courted for 8 months. The one whose diligence teams he pretended were from Boston. The one who rejected 2 of his proposed board members because I don't hire yes men. The one who sent a courier yesterday. Silence. A long, hollow silence. Then, you don't have that kind of money. You manage. I own the vehicles that manage, I said. The structure exists to keep men like your father from trying to turn what I do into a parade float. You lied to me. No, I said. I omitted the part of my life that turns into a weapon in the wrong room. So you're punishing him because he hurt your pride. The clock on my desk clicked once. I withdrew because I refused to subsidize his contempt. Pride is supposed to protect you from that. He didn't bruise mine. He revealed yours. Her breathing roughened. The part of me that still wanted to protect her almost softened. Then my phone buzzed with a delivery notification. Messages sent. Claire's handset chimed an echo through the line. Oh my God, she whispered. You actually. Don't make this about a single text, I said. This is about 3 years of you stirring eggs while he set the table on fire. She hung up. Arthur called 5 minutes later. He didn't waste time on punctuation. You arrogant little. You think you can pull the plug on a company like mine to teach me a lesson? There are 23 families. 23 families who deserved a CEO who listened to the memo that would have saved them $3 million. I said. That memo was cowardice. That memo was correct. There was a beat of static. When he spoke again, the volume was lower, the tone metallic. What do you want? Nothing. No one with money says nothing. You want the board. You want me out. I want you to need a man you called worthless and taste the salt of it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't swear. I hung up and turned my phone off. Divorce papers arrived 3 days later in a manila envelope that smelled faintly of ink and brand new resolve. Claire didn't come herself. She had her attorney send a covering letter about incompatibility and irreconcilable visions, the way people talk when they don't want you to hear the word shame. I signed. I didn't contest. I put the pen down and stared at the window until the city lights looked like data points. But the story you're here for isn't about a marriage. It's about what happens when a man who built his identity out of noise finally meets the quiet he has earned. The biotech community is gossip with a lab coat on. Within a week of my withdrawal, 2 other potential investors stepped back with polite platitudes about strategic realignment. Vendors asked for deposits up front. A partner who'd been tolerating delayed deliverables decided their brand didn't need more excuses. Arthur tried to plug the leaks with press releases about refined focus and exciting pipeline advancements. The reporters who still took his calls had editors who still took mine. No one wrote about me. They wrote about risk and leadership and the way a single bad call can echo through payroll. He cut 8 positions, then 12. He closed a secondary lab in an office park that still smelled like someone else's startup. He sold the house in Vail. He sold the club membership. He sold the second car, the one he never drove, the one he kept for the driveway. On a Tuesday afternoon in late winter, I drove past his old house. He was on his knees in the front garden, gloved hands in the black loam where the landscapers used to kneel for him. He was pulling weeds with a focus that looked like prayer. For a second, I almost rolled down my window and offered him a bottle of water. Then I remembered the birthday and the boat. 6 months later, Winslow Biotech filed for bankruptcy protection. A larger firm carved out the assets worth digesting. The employees who weren't absorbed received envelopes that changed their lives and not in the ways their spouses had planned. Arthur took a consulting role in a beige office near the airport that might as well have been inside a storage unit. He started telling people he preferred being hands-on again. People who had never met him nodded and asked about his weekend. I didn't celebrate. I don't dance on graves. I believe in gravity and craft and consequence. I believe that there is a difference between a shove and a step. I simply kept walking. Portland is good for people who need rain to remind them they're alive. I moved my operations there and opened a small office with windows that made even the worst days look cinematic. Seattle would have made more sense for tech, but sense isn't the only metric. Amberline Capital, one of my visible entities, grew quietly. We did 3 clean deals in a row. A medical telemetry firm with a founder who preferred truth to pitch decks. A logistics software company whose CFO kept her receipts like love letters. A rehabilitation device startup run by a pair of engineers who corrected me gently when I mispronounced their component supplier. I like people who care about nouns. Claire didn't call. I didn't expect her to. She resurfaced in a journal I subscribed to, third author on a paper about vector delivery optimization, her affiliation listed as River West Research Institute, San Diego. I read her sections twice, not because I needed to check her math, but because it reminded me why I fell in love with a voice that always put the right word in the right place. I mailed her a copy of the article with the margin beside one paragraph lightly underlined. No note, just a quiet acknowledgement that we had both kept the parts of ourselves that mattered most. If this were a neat story, it would end there, with a moral about dignity and boundaries and the power of refusing to fund a bully. But stories where money and family collide never end with a single choice. They ripple. They branch. They come back around and test whether you actually meant what you said when it didn't cost you anything. The test arrived one spring afternoon in the form of Dr. Maya Leland, a research lead at River West and one of Claire's co-authors. She asked for a meeting on background. We met at a coffee house where the mugs felt heavy enough to anchor boats. Arthur has been calling again, she said without preface. Arthur calls everyone, I said. He thinks persistence is a personality. He called the Institute, she clarified. Not about Claire. About funding. He wants us to collaborate on a new platform he's pitching a different company about. He said he has silent backing. He implied it was you. I stared at her for a second that tasted like iron. He implied what? That you'd reconsidered. That the feud is over and you'll bless what comes next. I laughed once. The sound surprised both of us. He still believes belief is a strategy. I told him the Institute follows data, Maya said. But I thought you should know. Not for drama. For clarity. Thank you, I said. Clarity is the only currency I keep in my pocket. After Maya left, I sat with the swirl of foam in my cup and tried to decide what, if anything, a man owes to a ghost who used to put his feet on your coffee table. I thought about calling Arthur. I thought about ignoring him. I thought about the employees whose livelihoods were fibers in a braid he had pulled apart. I called Mark instead. Hypothetically, I said, if a person wanted to prevent a specific individual from using that person's name in connection with any future investments, what shape would that paper take? Mark chuckled. A strongly worded cease and desist today, a not-so-friendly injunction tomorrow, and a habit of never leaving hypothetical on a voicemail. We sent the letter. It was polite, pointed, and litigious enough that even Arthur's pride would calculate the odds correctly. He went silent again. The industry is a small town wearing a lab coat. Word spread that whatever comeback he was trying to mount would not be buoyed by ghosts. The question most people ask, once they hear enough of the story to feel brave, is the same. Would you have invested if he hadn't insulted you? It's a child's question dressed as an adult's, and I don't blame them for asking. We want villains to be punished by heroes, not by spreadsheets. We want the why to be bigger than the what. The truth is simpler and crueler. I would have invested if I believed the science would be served by the money and the man wouldn't ruin it. Arthur's contempt didn't change my model. It changed the control features I would have demanded, and he would never have accepted them because he cannot buy a thing he cannot own publicly. There is a version of this story where I saved his company against his will, took the board seat, fired him in a closed session he never saw coming, and hired Claire's old team back at a 20% premium. That version satisfies the part of you that likes third-act reversals and men getting exactly what someone else believes they deserve. I don't live in that version. I live in the one where a man who has spent his life mistaking volume for value finally meets silence that won't break for him. I know what you're thinking. You wanted revenge. No, I wanted calibration. Revenge requires a chase. Calibration requires a measurement. He measured me publicly for 3 years. I measured him privately once. A year after the bankruptcy, my office intercom buzzed with a name I hadn't heard in 18 months. Harriet Winslow, Arthur's ex-wife and Claire's mother. She arrived in a coat that could stop rain and gossip both. "I'm not here to apologize for Arthur," she said, setting her bag down with an elegance that felt like punctuation. "He's made his bed and asked others to lie in it with him for 30 years. Then why are you here?" I asked. My voice came out more gently than I planned. "Because you're not the only ghost who knows how to fill out a wire instruction form," she said. "And because I think you might appreciate clarity in a story you've only seen one version of." She told me the things mothers tell when they are tired of watching their children become careful in rooms where they should be safe. She told me how Arthur learned early that shame is contagious, that if you make someone else feel small, they'll spend years trying to grow tall enough to stop you. She told me how Claire perfected the art of de-escalation because escalation in their house meant exile and quiet meant breakfast. And then she told me the piece I didn't have. After the birthday dinner, Claire had gone home to her mother's house, sat at the kitchen table, and finally told the truth without stirring eggs to build a rhythm for it. She told Harriet about the way Arthur's voice filled every space until it became a ceiling. She told her about me, about money and silence, and a man who decided not to be a bridge between a bully and a lab. "She said she loved you," Harriet finished. "She also said she didn't know how to pick you in front of him. You were asking her to choose a language she'd never been allowed to speak." I looked at my hands. "She filed for divorce 3 days later." "She filed?" Harriet agreed. "Because she believed you had already divorced her by divorcing her father. She didn't understand that you were divorcing a habit, not a person. No one teaches you the difference if your father is always the loudest man in the room." We sat for a while with that. Then Harriet reached into her bag and took out a small envelope. Inside was a photo of Claire at 6 in a paper crown, sitting at a table with a cake shaped like a castle. Next to her was a woman with a kind smile who was not Harriet. "Her nanny," Harriet said, answering the question I hadn't asked. "The only person who ever told Arthur no without paying for it. He fired her a week later, of course, but not before she taught Claire how to hold a fork and a fact at the same time." I slid the photo back into the envelope and returned it. "Thank you," I said. "Don't rescue him," Harriet said, standing. "He's on round 3 of trying to sell vapor to people with degrees. He'll call you again. Don't answer. You gave him the kindness of no once. It would be cruelty to teach him that persistence pays." "I don't plan to," I said. She smiled, tired and real. "Good. It's hard to convince men who build empires out of noise that silence isn't negotiable. There's a particular stillness that visits a life after you do something irreversible and live. It's not peace. Peace is a blanket. This is a chair, useful, upright, unforgiving if you fall asleep in it. You sit in it while you work. You stand up from it when you need to pace. You do not curl up in it and pretend the world isn't still loud outside your windows." Over the next 2 years, I learned that anger can be efficient if you drain it of sugar. I trained 2 new associates to read cap tables like topographical maps. I taught a junior analyst that founder-led is not always a compliment. I took meetings with people who prefer honest terms to pretty decks. I said no more than I said yes. I slept. Sometimes, when the rain on my Portland windows sounded like fingers tapping a desk, I imagined the version of my life where I said yes to Arthur. I saw the boardroom, the vote, the way he'd have tried to turn my money into proof he was right. I imagined the moment he'd have blamed me for the first delay my veto forced. I pictured the look on Claire's face when she realized love had become a project plan. Then I pictured that birthday table again, the boat story, the laugh, the pinch of her nails under the table asking me to be small to keep a moment calm. And I felt the same cold clarity I felt the morning I told him he was right. She did deserve better. So did I? 2.5 years after I turned off my phone on Arthur, my assistant buzzed and said a reporter was on line 3 asking about a comment on background. I don't mind reporters when they respect borders. This one did. We're doing a piece on leadership transitions in mid-size biotech, she said. There's a paragraph about Winslow Biotech's bankruptcy. Off the record, were you the investor who walked? Off the record, I said, no comment. On the record? On the record, I said, leadership is a capital asset you depreciate every time you confuse volume with vision. She laughed. That's not printable. That's why you asked off the record first. Fair enough, she said. One more. Is there a lesson here for founders? There's always a lesson, I said. Don't punish the people who tell you the truth, especially when the truth can save your company. And don't teach your family to be quiet and then act surprised when silence arrives wearing a suit. She thanked me. I hung up and looked out at a city rinsed clean by afternoon rain. Stories want bows. People want the moment where the music swells and a life learns to be tidy. I can give you versions of that if you like. Here's one. 3 years after the collapse, I ran into Arthur at an airport newsstand. He looked smaller, as if the air had leaked out of a balloon he'd carried too long. He saw me, opened his mouth, and closed it again. He nodded. I nodded back. That's all. A man who once filled rooms with contempt learned how to hold a second without trying to fill it. That's a bow if you want one. Here's another. I met someone. Not a scientist. A school administrator who can balance 6 budgets and a soccer schedule while remembering the names of the kids who need a second tray at lunch. She doesn't mind that my work is a shadow play. She minds that I leave dishes soaking as if time is a solvent. We're teaching each other different kinds of patience. That's a bow if you prefer love to accounting. And here's the one you probably came for. Was the revenge worth it? If by revenge you mean teaching a man that the world has edges he can't sand down with money or noise, then yes. If by revenge you mean hurting someone because it hurts, then no. I didn't light a fire. I watched a man refuse to see the sparks he threw behind him and didn't hand him a bucket. I still think about the first sentence I said to Arthur the morning everything changed. It remains the truest thing in this story. Claire deserved better. She deserved a father who could be wrong without making everyone around him pay. She deserved a husband who wouldn't require her to translate courage she'd never been allowed to speak. I couldn't be both her teacher and her student, not in that house. So I chose silence. Not absence, not cruelty, silence. The kind that lets a man hear what his life sounds like when no one is damping the echoes for him. Arthur learned that respect isn't something you demand or inherit. It's something you earn from the people who can't be forced to give it. He learned it in a beige office by an airport, while a ghost he used to insult ate noodles with a woman who knows the names of children who need seconds. If you want to know the last thing I ever said to him, it wasn't in a text or an email. It was a message he'll never read, said out loud in an empty kitchen with a cup of coffee I didn't finish. You were right about one thing. She did deserve better. We both did. And sometimes the only way to give someone better is to stop giving a bully your money. I washed the cup. I turned off the light. And I went back to my favorite kind of work, the kind where the only time my name appears is on the inside of a leather folder no one else is allowed to open. And the only loud thing in the room is the sound of a pen saying yes to people who tell the truth even when it costs them. 18 months after the airport nod, a junior associate at a firm I mentor sent over a deck. The logo on the cover belonged to a new biotech aggregator looking to consolidate post-bankruptcy assets under seasoned strategic leadership. The leadership slide made me laugh. Executive Chair, AW. They were trying to get back in the game with other people's chips. We're not participating, I told my associate. And if anyone asks why, tell them we prefer to invest in lab notes over personality notes. She smiled. That's a line I'm stealing. Steal this instead, I said. When you decide what kind of deals to make, ask yourself two questions. Does the money make the science truer? And does the leadership make the people braver? If the answer to either is no, walk. That's the lesson I bought for $15 million I didn't spend. It's the interest I collect every time I say no to anyone who thinks volume is a virtue. As for Arthur, he'll keep dialing numbers and hoping his voice still opens doors. Sometimes it will. The world is generous to men who pretend confidence is competence. But not with my help. Not with my name. Not with the people I've decided to fund. Sometimes the most devastating rescue is the one you never perform. Sometimes the cleanest revenge is the consequence you allow to arrive on time. And sometimes the quietest man at the table is the one who owns the table, the room, and the deed to the building. He just prefers to let other people think the valet owns the keys.